Hello, and welcome back to Varn Blog Solo. And this is Why Alienation is Real, Part 2, or Much Ado About a Sack of Potatoes. Now, I'm going to do a few historical arguments here and a few factual ones as well. And like the last video in this solo series, I'm going to also point out that there's historical evidence for this. But let's get past all the abstraction and historical evidence for a minute. All right, let's get beyond that, because in a certain sense, I am the wrong person, and this is the wrong medium for me to get you to feel history. And if you treat this as a historical puzzle and not part of your lived life, we always talk about lived experience, but then we really avoid it on this issue, then we have to really take apart a few central notions, and it all becomes a puzzle just to figure out. They're bullshit jobs because people feel like they're not being productive. As David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs argues. The interesting thing about Graeber there is he actually assumes, the emic reporting, which is a fancy word for it, that people know why they feel what they feel. And as we kind of all know, people are actually good at feeling things and know why they do things until you ask them to justify it, and then they come up with bullshit. This job is useless. Well, then why does it exist? What's the purpose of this productive economy? Well, it's class solidarity. It's the PMC replicating itself. That's Graeber's argument. But why would the PMC ever replicate its power that deeply or that much? Right? Why would a intermediate stratum of society that has a disproportionate amount of power expand itself and keep itself busy with useless tasks? Is it because we don't need them because of automation? Which is a socially necessary condition, which if you got rid of, what would we do? I mean, Graeber would probably say we would all just hang out and not work or whatever, but that's probably not true. Just like if you've ever made something for yourself and then made it as a job, or even loved to read, but then didn't want to read when a teacher told you to, that choice and agency and all those words that we often throw around in a system where agency is largely fake is something that people feel is important. And before you go on your arguing about how agency is an illusion because of a mechanistic universe, so what? Even if you're right about that, then all contra politics, by the way, is beyond the point. You couldn't help but be the way you are. Nothing can change society anyway, because it's all going to be what it was always going to be. That is the logic of that argument, by the way. You either accept that or you don't. Now, I am not a counter-causal free real person, as in I don't believe people just come up with their will on their own, but that's sort of irrelevant. They do have a will, they do have agency, and people do make choices, and those choices do have effects. Now, extrapolating from the collective to the individual, or to be more precise, the aggregate to the individual, is not always helpful, because we have to say aggregate, because aggregate is a collective that is just a statistical reality. It's just the patterns that exist statistically when you look at the way people interact in their own ecology. That's an aggregate. There are other kinds of collectives. There are collectives that, while they have collective decision-making bodies like governments or boards of directors or HR departments, those collectives are still made up of individuals that have agency, where the collectives are just the form in which that agency of individuals is manifested. But it also helps inform and develop the individual consciousness, which is why, who are your friends matters. What you do matters. What kind of behavior you accept matters. And not just selectively in the moral sense, where we should feel poor, sad for the downtrodden and we should support them. No, we should give them a community because it gives them something to do or responsibility to have and people to fight for. Like every study I see indicates that the more people are inculcated into a community and the more they feel physically responsible to the community, and physicality is important here, we'll get to why in a minute, and the more they feel like they are creating something of their own volition and contributing of their own volition, that the solidarity is a choice that they've made, not something that is forced on them, a lot of the other social pathologies that exist, that we're not even comfortable calling pathologies anymore, go away. You want to see someone's alcoholism get worse? Leave them alone. And then see what happens when you try to reintegrate them into society. It's really, really hard. They've been inculcated in patterns that separate them from people. And then when you try to bring them back in, they can't reintegrate. Right? That is both an individual and collective responsibility. But if you feel like what you're contributing to doesn't help you personally as an individual, if you feel like what you are doing, even if it's altruistic, doesn't feed some need in your life and contribute to you in a sensuous and real way, you are going to feel alienated from that project. So no wonder most people feel alienated from their labor. Think about it. Why did Marx think that the French peasantry in particular was a sack of potatoes? He wasn't just calling them stupid, although rural idiocy was part of his promise, but he was indicating that people learn from each other, that learning is social, and that organization is social, that discipline is social. And they learn best from people who are their peers. And if you've ever been a teacher, you know this. You set the tone, you lead, and the peers actually do a lot of the education through your modeling, leadership, and direct instruction. All right? And in a fair society, when you don't do that, you lose that respect. Conversely, you can't organize people you don't respect. That is Rule 101. And pity, my friends, is not respect. Victimization is not respect. Now, I don't want to go off on the victimization culture stuff that conservatives do, but there is a real sense that if you see everyone you're organizing as victims, you really can't help them. Because what you see them as is disempowered, and that's fundamental to the way you think they act. I think about this when we talk about boys a lot and why the Jordan Peterson approach to men doesn't really work. He's always talking about how we need to focus more on boys, but he doesn't really want boys to change. He wants them to be validated. Ironically, despite his heroic hero myth and all this stuff about integrating and making your own bed, there's a fundamental assumption that isn't that different from anybody who thinks any identity should be flattered to maintain them. But I've talked about the decline of friendship. The decline of friendship in most countries disproportionately affects men who increasingly only see their parents as a form of emotional support. And that's mostly out of social obligation. Is it any surprise to you that the kind of social ills that we see keep emerging? And if your answer is that all masculinity is toxic, there's a case in which I might agree with you, because I have, in addition to a view of liberation, a somewhat tragic worldview around the way people are socialized. Let's be honest about that. I think most of us are not just fighting against our oppressors or the social classes that exploit us, but also against elements of ourselves that want that safety. See, safety is how they get you. But Marx, talking about the sack of potatoes, was talking about how the specific kind of peasantry that existed, alienated from even village life in France, was given towards religion, which made up for its other communities that did not exist, but was a real sensuous community, which it was going to defend. And then in its absence of social community, would project that upon the king or emperor. That the division between urban and rural life led to rural alienation. Now, some people like parts of rural alienation. They like that freedom, right? And as a person who completely knows that people often like to be in the nowhere and prance around naked, that it makes sense. But to a certain degree, they also still need community. Community is a vague term. It can mean a lot of things to a lot of people because it's a collective abstraction. But in a real sense, you need people to which you are responsible and to which you help build their lives, and they need you too. And if that is not the case, you will feel alienated. And if someone takes the products of your labor, how your work actually improves other people's lives, how not your work actually improves other people's lives because someone's skimming off the top, but that your vision in creating something improves someone else. Well, you really do see that when people talk about labor that's meaningful for them. But we also know that our entire society would fall apart. Capitalism would not function if we were all petty proprietors. Nor do most petty proprietors make enough money to survive in the long run. There's a real sense of this when you talk about the way people feel about, say, the small farmer who is really a rarity. There aren't that many of them anymore. Or the bodega owner in the city who is also not a rarity, but is always at threat of being pushed out. Or the small business owner has to charge more because of the inefficient uses of their labor, but to who you do feel some real social relationship. This is why you have trouble convincing leftists to not always talk in this way, even though there is a real inefficiency in that kind of labor. But when they push beyond the utility maximizing monster that a lot of people think leftism should be in the efficiency of centralization, people feel like they're in a blind, robotic system. And in many ways they are. See, that sack of potatoes, as Matt Christman has said before, has become Pringles in a can. And while he plays the role of prophet a lot of the time, let's think that that is actually kind of true. See, there's another truth about this. Our attempts to get sociality, particularly in certain social situations, and particularly with people who identify as men, often leads people to feel as if they are not valued. And then the only thing they have to fall back on is entitlement, because they have no way to express any other value. This gives you no incentive not to be lazy. And yes, laziness is a problem. People come to me and go, I want the right to be lazy. And I'm like, no, you want the right not to work. You want a right not to have people inform your life, right? If you really want a right to be lazy, then I don't know what you're going to produce.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent? but I won't attack it because someone sicks me on it. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.